Hey, what's going on, guys? Vega here from Serpent X Special Forces, and in this video I want to talk about the RTX 3080, specifically the Nvidia's Founder Edition, the new design that they developed, because I'm concerned, or I had some concerns about it impacting internal temperatures for your case. Now, every variable in every case is different depending on the airflow, the ambient air, and so on and so forth. I try to keep the variables to a minimum, trying to keep the fans the same, everything the same between testing various GPUs, but I have some data for you, and then we're going to wrap up with my final thoughts. So stick to the end so that way you can find out yay or nay. But first off, we got to look at the design of the fans. Basically, this new design, we're taking in air from the front of the case, and then it's being directly exhausted straight up because we have a fan in the front or towards the front of the case that's blowing air directly up. It's sucking air through here and is blowing it out, which will eventually be exhausted either by the top or the back in general. Then as we have additional airflow, we have this one at the back end here that's just taking in air and blowing it directly out of the case. So one of my concerns was, is this rear fan going to heat up thermals specifically along the VRMs and the liquid AIO? Because what happens is once these internal temperatures begin to climb up, the AIO or liquid temperature of your AIO will increase as well. I have some data for you, but again, stick till the end. So first off, I tested the system with the 1660 Super. It is a low TDP GPU, so it doesn't produce a lot of heat, and it's a AIB model versus the reference design. So, you know, it just disperses air into the case, yes, but it's not outputting as much heat. And there's a lot of data to unpack, so bear with me. But the CPU temperatures, the maximum I saw was 54.3, while the average was 34.4 and 31. Now this is during mining. The first three slides are going to be for mining, the next three will be for gaming, and then I have some additional information looking at my NvMe drive, because if we look, and it's kind of hard to tell, but the NvMe or the M.2 is directly above the GPU, and that does impact, you know, even with a heatsink, it will impact the thermals of that NvMe drive. It's the Corsair MP600. Now, the liquid temperatures with the 1660 Super hit a max of 33.5, average of 32.1. And with liquid temperatures, you mostly, you're fine up until like the higher 40s or the mid to high 40s. Even then, you're still fine. I believe as long as you're staying below 45°C in liquid temperatures, you're fine, but even that's a little bit uncomfortable for me. The VRMs, which is, I got some thermal probes. So over here on this top set of VRMs, I have a thermal probe, and then over here in the front, you can barely see it. Let me draw it for you. You can barely see it, but I have a thermal probe right here. That's the air intake temperature, and then the other one's measuring the VRM thermals, comparing against software, because I do have, obviously with hardware info, we can compare the thermals as well. It hit 44.3 as a max, but 39.7 as a average. And then additional information right here is with hardware info measuring, you know, it's measuring its own thermals. At least the motherboard is, the Asrock Z390 Taichi Ultimate. The chipset, which is in the lower section of this system, right here underneath the video card, I was concerned that it will be impacted as well. So let's look at the 1660 Super. The max was 63, the average was 55.8. Now with those numbers in mind, we switch over to the RTX 2080, which right now is currently in my system. It's the Asus Dual RTX 2080. The CPU hit a max of 54, or excuse me, on the, hit a max of 54 and then 34.4 on the CPU, but with the 2080, we only seen a minor increase of 55 degrees Celsius versus 35 on average. So not much of an increase there. The liquid temperatures, minor increase, like 0.2 of a degree on maximum and about 0.4 as an average. So not much of an impact whatsoever. Again, both of these cards are AIB models, not the Founders Edition design, or at least not the unique design that Nvidia came up with this model. The VRM thermal probe did increase thermally. Now, the difference here is TDP. We got a 1660 Super, which is not rated for as high as the 2080, and keep that in mind because the 3080 is even hotter, or it draws more wattage. And that's really the key difference between these GPUs. If I were to take a 3080 AIB and compare it against a 3080 Founders Edition, I'm pretty sure that will be the difference. It's not so much the design, it's the amount of watts that it's pulling, the card is pulling, and the TDP that it's rated for. Looking at the chipset temperature, we did increase almost 5 degrees. 67 was the max on the 2080, and 64.8 was the average, versus 55.8. So again, the 1660 Super is not outputting as much heat as the 2080, thus increasing the internal temperatures throughout the system. The liquid not so much, CPU not so much, but primarily the VRMs and like the thermal probes and stuff like that. The 3080 is where we see a significant increase. If you look at the CPU during mining on the 2080, yes, we only increased a little bit, 56.7 as a max versus 35 and 37. So we increased about 2 degrees, almost 2 degrees on the average, but only 1.7 on the max. The liquid temperatures did increase almost 3 degrees. So once that internal case starts to heat up, as it starts to fill up with hot air that's just getting stuck here and not getting flowed out or getting drawn out the case, it will heat up this AIO. And we saw that because the overall liquid temperatures has increased, from 32.5 to 33.9. That's almost a 1 degree difference. The max was 36.2 versus 33.7. However, maybe Windows was doing something silly at that time. But then let's move on to the VRM thermals. The VRM thermals, we saw a max of 48.2 and 45.5 on the average versus 49.4 and 47.6. So we got a couple degrees there, 1 to 2 degrees there. And then on the chipset temperature, look at the difference. 69 max, 66.4 average. So we got 2 degrees increase on the chipset temperature. Again, the card, even the 2080, because it's a triple slot design, the 3080 is a dual slot design, which is why this design, this reference design is the way it is compact, and it needs to have sufficient cooling. We got the back fan helping cool the fin stack that's cooling the helping cool the GPU, dissipating the heat from the heat pipes, the memory, and so on and so forth, while the rear one is just taking air and directing it straight out the back. But with a triple slot design, as the 2080 from Asus, it's sitting, most of the card is sitting right on top of that chipset. But even still, the 3080 was getting the chipset a lot warmer. Typically, I wouldn't recommend your chipset getting, upwards of 80 degrees Celsius, but just bear that in mind. Moving on to gaming specifically, this is where the CPU gets impacted the most, because during mining you're not utilizing your CPU, you're using your GPU. So the max CPU was 73, the average was 63.3, and the liquid temps hit 37.2 versus 33.7. The 2080 jumped us up by 2 degrees on the max and almost 2 degrees on the average. And then as far as the liquid temperatures, we almost got into the 40s, 39.3 at the max and 38.1 as the average. So that's almost a 5 degree increase. But again, that's because we're stressing the CPU by gaming. The GPU and CPU are both working hard. This is going to increase internal temperatures anyway, no matter what. The VRM thermals, we saw a max of 50, and this is the probe. This is my thermistor, not the software temperatures. 50 at the max, 46.3 as the average, versus the board reading its sensor of 62 max, 58.7 average. And then look at the VRM temperatures during gaming. 70 max, and then 66.5 average. And then almost 6 degrees from my thermistor, or my thermal probe. We got 6 degrees on the max, and then 46 to 55, almost 10 degrees on an average. Again, the 1660 Super is not outputting as much heat because it's not as high a TDP as the 2080. So we got to keep all that in mind. Chipset temperatures hit 73 max, 70 degrees average, versus about 60 degrees average on the 1660 Super. But jumping up to the 3080, the chipset jumped up to 77 degrees max, 73 average, and that's basically almost 3 to 4 degrees increase in chipset temperature. Now the CPU was even warmer because, again, once the liquid temperature started to increase and once the overall system got up to temp, it's hard to dissipate all that, or it levels off, so to speak, at a certain temperature. The 3080, we saw our CPU hit at 82 at max, but 70 on average. That's a 5-degree increase from this higher watt TDP or higher power drawing card being in this overall system. The liquid temperature shot up to 41.4, 40.5 average, about anywhere from half a degree to about 2 degrees increase in liquid temperatures. Not too bad, but nonetheless it is an increase. And then the VRM thermals, again, my thermal probe hitting 57.7 as a max, 56.3 as an average, versus what we see on the 2080. So we got about a degree to almost 2 degree increase in the VRM thermal, the VRM probe that I have, thermal probe that I have. The software temperatures increased actually more on the 2080 than it did on the 3080, which is odd to me. So again, maybe something was happening in the background. I try to keep the test the same, but I can't control Windows. But it's basically the same. So we can expect about 70 degrees or 66, versus 64. So around 66 degrees, 67 degrees average for the VRMs. At least that's what Asrock and its motherboard sensor is detecting. The chipset temperature definitely got a lot warmer. Now bear with me, we're moving on to my NvMe drive. Now these are the temperatures, max, average, and min, between the 1660 Super, the RTX 2080, and the RTX 3080. Now throughout this entire test, I try to keep all the variables the same: fan speeds, noise normalized, as well as the ambient temperature in my room or in the area where I was working. The 1660 Super, you can see, hit a max of 51 compared to 55 on the 2080, and compared to a 59 on the 3080. Now once your NvMe drives hit a certain temperature, it will start to throttle itself, and you don't get to experience or obtain all of the performance, especially since this drive is a Gen 4 NvMe on a Gen 3 motherboard. So every little bit counts, considering that I'm working from a handicap, because I do plan on upgrading eventually in the future. It's just this is perfectly fine for what I need to do at this time. The average temperature on the 1660 Super was 49 versus 53 on the 2080 versus 58 on the 3080. Now this is only during mining, so only the GPU is doing all the work, but we still see an increase of almost 5 degrees jumping from the 2080 to the 3080, and then another 4 degrees jumping from the 1660 Super to the 2080. All three cards are right below the NvMe drive, so that will have a significant impact. Moving on to gaming though, the temperatures get even hotter because we're utilizing the CPU and GPU, so you can see the jump there, right? 53 average on the 1660 Super versus 58 on the RTX 2080, and then 61 on the 3080. So once we got above a certain temperature on the NvMe drive, it wasn't getting too much hotter compared to the 5 degree difference during mining when we were utilizing you know, the CPU and GPU at the same time. Yes, we hit a max of 65 compared to 59, and an average of 61 compared to 58. It was only a minor increase over the 2080 of about 3 degrees. 3 degrees at the average, 4 degrees on the max. Now, just this data is for you to draw comparisons, because upgrading to the 30 series at all is going to increase the thermals, or the interior thermals of your computer case. It's just going to happen. However, this does not mean that the FE edition is not an efficient cooler. It is an efficient cooler. The real difference between these different GPUs is the amount of watts it pulls, the amount of TDP it's rated at, right? So during gaming, we got the RTX 3080 pulling about 320 watts versus the 2080 that might be pulling only 220, 250. And then the 1660 Super that might be only pulling, you know, 120, 125, somewhere in there with a modest overclock, if really. All of these are ran at out-of-the-box GPU boost thermals. I just kept the fans the same, and I let the card, and what I mean by fans is noise normalized, right? Because we really want the cards to determine GPU boost. If I can lock it at a certain overclock, I would, but there's a lot of fluctuation depending on the gaming title and all that stuff. But the main point that I'm trying to make here is, just like Jay's 2 cents, who advised everybody, you know, no, it's not a negative impact that the Nvidia Founders Edition has on your computer case, because he compared a 3080 AIB against a 3080 Founders Edition. There was no impact whatsoever. I mean, the difference was minute, and actually the FE Founders Edition card performed better than the AIB because of the efficient design that Nvidia came out with this time. What the difference here is, in my testing, is we're jumping up in higher wattage cards that pull more watts and output more heat and has a higher TDP. But it will impact you. So if you don't have a good case with good airflow and you only have like one front fan and one rear fan, you might need to get additional fans to cool your internals of your system, as well as the GPU. If you can keep that GPU cool, you keep everything else cool. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Do me a favor, hit the like button on the way out, subscribe for more content like this, and let me know in the comments below what you think. You guys take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.